Hello, I am Jelka Vukobratović and I thank the organizers for this opportunity. My presentation is going to deal with a historiographic approach in ethnomusicological research. In 2017, in a town of Križevci in central Croatia, one of the local amateur folklore societies presented a new choreography. The choreography was set to a locally composed 19th century quadrille. The music part of the dance was accidentally rediscovered in 2016, after which it was recorded by the town wind orchestra and choreographed. Before the premiere, a recording of the rehearsal was published on the Folklore Society's Facebook page and triggered a heated discussion. This online discussion was not aimed towards the music or the choreography, but towards the dancers personally. It started when one of the members of the society commented that the female dancers on the video looked too old for this dance. After negative reactions to the comment, the commentator clarified that what she was criticizing was not the dancers' age per se, but their apparent lack of gracefulness required for this, quote, royal dance. This gracefulness, she wrote, one has to have by nature and it cannot be learned. A few more commentators joined in on her side, stating that the dancers didn't have a required aristocratic postures and that for this dance a dancer should have ladylike manners and not those of a village grandma, in Croatian damski a ne babski. This discussion revealed a specific kind of perception of history within the revival of this historic dance. As revivalists are commonly not only concerned with the music itself, but also with the projected values and partly imagined lifestyles they associate with it, as Juniper Hill and Caroline Biethel wrote, the narratives of Croatian historic dance revivalists were likewise shaped by their perception of the history and the imagined lifestyles of higher classes. Their perception of the history and attitudes towards its revival, however, were built and influenced by outside politico-historic forces as well. In order to explain the logic of the above stated views of the commentators, I will first clarify the four different contexts which helped in shaping the revivalists' narratives. The context of folklore amateurism, the context of ethnographic scholarship, the context of the state cultural politics, and the context of ethnographic research in Križevci area. These four contexts will be explained through their own historical perspective. The folklore amateurism in Croatia developed in the early 20th century. After the initial interest of the 19th century national revivalists, a more concrete incentive came from the Croatian Peasants' Party, which organized village singing choirs in the 1920s. The form of singing choirs was soon replaced by less formal instrumental or singing groups and dancers, which agreed more with the existing rural traditions. In this way, the folklore groups started to enact and revitalize the domestic and authentic music practices. The underlying ideal of early folklore amateurism was that the national identity lies in the rural traditions because they are old, uncorrupted, true, and authentic. Although narratives of authenticity are a common feature of music revivalism in general, as Max Peter Baumann pointed out, In Croatia, attitudes towards authenticity in the organized folklore societies were in the beginning carefully built and implemented top-down, on the first level by researchers, ethnologists and ethnomusicologists who formed committees in folklore festivals, and on the second level by the current state ideologies. This brings us to the context of the history of Croatian ethnographic disciplines. Even though the ethnographic fieldwork and ethnomusicological research are necessarily placed in the present, with the usage of conversations, interviews, and participant observation as its main techniques, part of Croatian and wider regional ethnomusicology have always been turned towards the music of the past. This has been evident through collecting and analyzing of older layers of traditional folk music and search for older music in the field. In the first part of the 20th century, still influenced by the cultural historic paradigm, Croatian ethnographic disciplines sought after the authentic in the rural culture, which was considered to be still pure from outside influences and a legitimate source of national identity. This phase of Croatian ethnomusicology, where only the examples of older, mainly village vocal musical traditions were sought for and noted down in the field, led the discipline more towards archaistic than realistic science, as Grozdana Marošević explained. The values of cultural historic paradigm pour out of the academic discourse into the sphere of folklore amateurism, where notable ethnographers played an active role of organizers and members of the juries in folklore festivals. A part of Croatian ethnology and ethnomusicology still continues to play this active role within the folklore amateurism today. Another part of the scholarship shifted the paradigm in the 1970s, stepping away from archaistic and essentialist understanding of national culture and setting course towards critical science about contemporary society and culture. Bringing focus on everyday life and culture, establishing urban sites as legitimate research field for ethnomusicologists and ethnologists, while recognizing the cultural dynamism of Croatian rural areas as well. This part of critical ethnographic scholarship didn't seem to influence the sphere of folklore amateurism in any way. The focus of folklore societies remained on the established repertoire of mostly rural songs and dances. These rural traditions are performed in two ways, either as choreographies representing diverse Croatian regions or local repertoire taught by the older members of the community. The division on these two types of representation appeared after the Second World War during socialism. Unlike the ethnographic paradigm shift, the new post-war regime did have an influence on folklore amateurism in Croatia and Yugoslavia. The state ideology and cultural politics hence represent the third context on which the revivalist narratives rely. Even though Anna Hoffman's research showed that the state cultural politics in socialist Yugoslavia didn't exert so much control over folklore amateurism as in other countries of the Eastern Bloc, the ideological framework was still subtly felt. The attitudes of the state were ambiguous towards folklore in a sense that folk practices were seen as backward and as potential carriers of unwanted nationalistic tendencies. The preferred repertoire avoided religious customs and relied on songs which connected wonderful richness of the past with creative workers' heroism of today, as the quote in Nela Ceribasić's book says. Among other things, this meant that the organized folklore in socialism was used to underline the idea of brotherhood and unity of the Yugoslav people and the value of rural culture as the culture of subjugated social classes. In a similar way, the change of political ideology was indirectly but noticeably felt in folklore amateurism after the fall of socialism. In the 1990s, the neglected religious music practices were brought forward, as well as the re-establishment of cultural differences along the ethnic boundaries. This was a post-socialist revivalist wave that Naila Ceribasić called the retraditionalization. Teribašić also recognized the increase of previously marginalized urban traditions of court and town dances within the repertoire of folklore ensembles. They appeared as a type of reactionary rehabilitation of nobility and social hierarchy enforced by touristic strategy of neo-romanticization of Croatian nobility. In the wider Zagreb area, there are a couple of amateur artistic organizations dedicated to the revival of aristocratic and bourgeois traditions, like Podkalnički plemenitaši from Gornja Rijeka and Plemička mladež from Zaprešić. The visual aspect and the role of the costumes and dresses plays a big role in the process of imagination and reviving of the aristocratic traditions. The appeal of princess-like attires is particularly evident in the fact that both of the above-mentioned societies organized beauty pageants for women and little girls. The contestants within this pageant appear dressed in the historic costumes and play the roles of court ladies. The specific attitude towards women's appearances was also present in the internet discussion from Križevci, to which we will return and explain its local specificities through the previous ethnographic research. The ethnographic research I am referring to was my own, and it relied partially on the investigation of the past music life and past local musicians. Regardless of the previous critique of the search for the older layers of music and its connection to disputed paradigms, new potentials have been recognized for historiography in contemporary ethnomusicological research. Thanks to this perspective, I was able to find out about the older repertoire from the area, as well as the history of the Križevci Folklore Society, which introduced the quadrille to its repertory. This society was not a newly formed organization dedicated exclusively to this type of repertoire, but a folklore society founded in the early 1980s. The choreography of the quadrille represented an innovation in its repertoire, which had previously been based on songs and dances of rural traditions. These rural traditions continued to be included in the society's performances even after the introduction of the quadrille. In fact, while performing the rural traditions, the members of the society built completely different narratives of authenticity. Unlike the subject of the online discussion, the authenticity dispute for the repertoire of rural dances revolved around questions of which song belonged to which village and whether they were domestic at all. The revivalist discourses have been reported to have a potential of becoming discriminatory, exclusionary, and racist, as for example Lodan Noshin's research on Iranian musicians showed. The elitist and discriminatory attitudes of Croatian historic dance revivalists must be understood in the light of reactionary attitudes against the previously explained historic contexts. First, its revival of neglected traditions of the aristocracy and bourgeoisie are a reaction against the pre-socialist representation of national traditions exclusively through rural practices. Secondly, it borrows the language of authenticity and legitimacy from early ethnographic disciplines and uses it for traditions of privileged classes. The usage of such discourse is seamlessly transferred to the revival of aristocratic dances because it lacks criticism and self-reflection, which modern ethnomusicology employed, but without an attempt of dialogue with folklore amateurism. Third, it is an opposition to the socialist disempowerment of aristocracy. It reconstitutes the historic social class hierarchy not only on stage, but reflects the associated idea of hereditary noble blood onto the dancers, as we have seen in the internet discussion. It is not by accident that the critique of inappropriateness was directed only towards the female dancers, reflecting the implementation of strict rules of conduct towards women as breeders and bearers of the proper lineage. The negative context about the older female dancers and the parallel occurrence of the beauty pageant in two organizations dedicated to aristocratic traditions reveals the perception of these dances as a form of debutante balls, where young women are presented to the society as potential suitable brides, although this perception is nowhere explicitly expressed. Fourth, the ethnographic research showed that this elitist discourse was applied only on the repertoire of bourgeois dances, while for the performances of rural dances, narrative of authenticity were similar to the ones from the first half of the 20th century. In order to explain contemporary music practice, I included 4 different historical perspectives defining its background. By this, the opposition between damski and babski, or ladylike and grandma-like, became metaphors for 2 different concepts of folklore revivalism. Whereas the grandmas belonged to pre-socialist usage of rural folklore as a representative of authentic national heritage, and socialist usage of the same type of folklore as the culture of subjugated class, the ladies represented reactionary visions of post-socialist folklore against the both earlier currents. I have tried to show not just an example of the necessity of historiographic approach in an ethnomusicological research, but the ways in which the ethnomusicology's historiography itself influences the past and the current musical practices. Finally, I have hoped to show how an implementation of historiographic approach in ethnomusical research is not a way of hiding from the present, but can help in illuminating problems and subjects of today. Thank you.
Today is September 25th, year 2020, and the place of our gathering is the official YouTube channel of the Young Musicology Belgrade conference. The informant is Maja Radivojević, who is presenting her research entitled Examining Contemporary Fieldwork Challenges, Researching Minority Music in Serbia. With this type of announcement starts almost every field research. The researcher announces the date and the place of the research and presents the informant from whom he will receive relevant information. My intention was to start this presentation in the same way as I start my research in the field, since in this way I transfer my 5-year experience of researching Vlach music in Serbia, my attempt to understand and to get to know the culture of this minority. I am currently in the role of the transmitter of Vlach traditional music practice because I present it both to the public of Serbia as well as to the world. The picture on the screen represents unofficial but most common way of starting a fieldwork in Serbia, a toast with rakia. So, let's begin. Exploring musical culture to which you approach as a cultural outsider brings with it many challenges. This is also the case with Vlach minority living in northeastern Serbia. The first obstacle for me was the language barrier, but research got further complicated by the current political developments and the vision of its members over how they see themselves. As a Vlachs, as a Serbs, or as a Romanians, which directly reflects on the musical practice and requires new considerations on the approach to the fieldwork itself. The first problem that arises is the question of who to choose as an informant. Should the selection be made exclusively on the basis of nationality or on the basis of knowledge of Vlach music? When I started my dissertation research, I interviewed exclusively Vlachs who perform Vlach music, that is, those who declare themselves as Vlachs. However, one case changed the way I chose the informants, since the Vlachs themselves in one village in the region of Homolje recommended a musician of Serbian origin as the best representative of their musical tradition. I compared his playing with the playing of other Vlachs and came to the conclusion that there are musical differences, but that they are not crucial when it comes to the representing the Vlach culture. Thus, performing of Vlach music in the public and even private sphere is not necessarily related only to members of the Vlach community. On the contrary, there are numerous examples of what I call them constructed insiders, that is, Serbs who perform Vlach music in this area and as ethnic outsiders are involved in forming the image of the musical life of Vlachs. On the picture, we can see Vlachs and Serbs playing together. In this regard also arises question how to choose the informant. In this sense, dilemma is should researcher go to the field announced or unannounced, whether to address local communities, cultural centers, and National Council of Vlachs, or go to the field without prior notice and inquire directly with the people in the village. In the first case, it is certainly easier to reach the informants and the act of the field work is taken much more seriously since they are delegated by a higher instance to better present their tradition and they are very clearly aware what I do and what I need. However, here we can see very clearly how the political scene affects the field work, since it often happened that certain institutions or organizations did not recommend an informant who is not like-minded in terms of nationality, and there were even cases where I was very openly drawn to bypass such an informant. The second possibility, that is, go to the field without prior notice, provides the opportunity to choose your informant yourself, regardless of his self-identification in terms of nationality. In this way, more objective information can be obtained, that is, those who are not nationally aware. However, the process of finding an informant is much slower and more difficult than is in the first case, and the phrase, quote, "If I knew what you need, I would prepare myself," end of quote, is often used. There is also the fact that people are not indifferent to let even a seemingly harmless stranger into their house and share with him information from their private life. Next dilemma is what aspects of musical life should be taken in consideration. It turned out that the musical expression of the Vlachs should be followed simultaneously on two levels, especially because turned out that the music performed and consumed within them is not always the same, and they reveal to us the reverse process of transmitting tradition from the media and the internet platform to the field. These are the level of private and the level of public life, which exist in parallel and are interdependent, but whose meanings in the domain of ethnicity do not have the same weight. The private sphere itself should also be researched on two levels. The first implies a musical tradition performed especially for the purpose of recording in the field outside the original context, and the second includes performing in an authentic context. My attention was drawn to this when I was recording performance of a song for summoning the deceased called Sakanta. When the singer finished her performance, one of the other present informants said, quote, "This looks a lot like a Sakanta, but if you want to hear how it really sounds, come to the cemetery for Easter memorial." End of quote. We will now hear two different examples of this form performed out of original context and within it by two different singers.
Squale, babo, squale, squalče pomenjašće. Aha, aha. Sovjetska rec je, a kuca venito. Aha, aha. Nje pockatare, šetu aj kreskuto. Aha, aha.
Squale, mume, squale. Squale, se centre bremo. De kun du jij du so.
terms of researching the public music life of Vlachs, in addition to various cultural events and media content, the internet platform is very important. Within it, the social network Facebook stands out because sublimates activities from private and public life of respondents on their private profiles, making them available to the public. This can also reveal facts that the informants kept silent or forgot to mention, and which especially refer to the negotiation of identity, Serbian and Vlach. In addition, there are important groups that can be formed on this social network and whose members almost daily debate on the issue of autochthony of the Vlachs in Serbia, calls for Vlach declaration on the issue of nationality, Romanization, pro-Romanian tendencies, original Vlach music, and so on. In the sense of Vlach cultural reconstruction, the question of the influence of researcher on the examined community is also inevitable. In addition to the researcher, special emphasis should be placed on the fieldwork experience of the informant, that is, how he or she understands our work, because it largely depends not only on what information we will receive, but also what will be informant's attitude towards his own tradition after the end of our field meeting. Informants also analyze our behavior, pay attention to the questions we ask, as well as to the almost every word we say in the field, and also take into account what is important to us as researchers. One of the examples is my indirect influence on the informant to learn one of the forms of songs from the posthumous ritual called Petrekatura, although that was not my original intention. Since this form has almost completely disappeared from the current practice of the Vlachs and represents one of the most archaic forms of their culture, it was very important to me to find a singer who knows how to perform it. After I explained this to one of my young singer informants, she made an effort to find a suitable informant for me, and she also insisted to be present during the interview. She used this as an opportunity to learn more about this form of singing and to learn it herself. She felt the need to perfect her knowledge of her own vocal practice, since she is often delegated to present musical heritage to the public. Even though the researcher influences are not always as transparent as in example I gave, and I don't say they should be, it is almost impossible that fieldwork has no effect on the informant, since the act itself interrupts his daily life with questions about his private life, which certainly has some consequences. On the screen, you can see the picture of that fieldwork. The issues of attitudes toward the researcher are particularly important, especially since the reconstruction of cultural values is in force in the Vlach community. Researcher is usually seen in two ways: as someone who can professionally contribute to this process, or as someone who, as a cultural outsider, should not deal with it at all. When it comes to the first case, professional competences of researcher are used in different ways by different institutions and associations. One of them was holding lectures on Vlach music in the Vlach community, which was not an easy task, since I passed the knowledge of Vlach tradition to its barriers. In addition, I was invited to hold a workshop on Vlach songs and to perform at several festivals as a singer of Vlach music. I must mention that I was warned once because I wrote historical facts that the members of some Vlach association did not like and which concerned the question of the origin of Vlachs, on which no consensus was reached in scientific circles. The second perspective is most often expressed by people in the field, especially when they hear that I cannot speak Vlach language. On one of my first fields in 2015, the informant openly told me that I should give up my idea of researching Vlach music because of the language barrier. This is why I started learning the Vlach language by getting a Vlach primer and a Vlach Serbian dictionary, and today I understand Vlach language much more than at the beginning of my research. Another reason why informants think I should not deal with Vlach music is precisely their dissatisfaction of how Vlach culture was presented in public until now by other researchers, whether it is case of ethnomusicologists or folklore amateurs. In addition to addressing issues from a dichotomous perspective, it will be explored a space that allows the researcher to take in-between position of both insider and outsider, and many of these I already mentioned earlier during my report. I actually opened this theme at the beginning of presentation when I told you that I am informant today. Currently, I am the biggest insider of Vlach music culture of all of us because I am both the selector and the transmitter of the Vlach culture. What you know about Vlach music are the facts I am telling you. Beside the lectures, presentations, and performing of Vlach music, in-between position is especially evident and important when the researcher is given the task of evaluating music performances of the culture he or she is researching. That is the fact that the researcher often becomes the member of the jury for some music competition or selector of some cultural manifestation. Yet, that does not make researcher an insider at all in Vlach community, at least not among village people. In-between position is actually in observer's perspective, that is the question in relation to what are we insiders or outsiders. Research on minority music in Serbia has once again confirmed that fieldwork is, quote, a defining method of ethnomusicology, end of quote. In the light of political events and the fact that this largely influences the construction of the Vlach tradition, especially in the public sphere of musical expression, the researcher, in addition to understand the culture to which he does not belong, must penetrate which facts were silenced to him and why. In that sense, it is very important for researcher to balance very carefully when it comes to dichotomy objectivity-loyalty. In such sensitive communities as Vlach, only one wrongly awarded prize, one wrongly stated fact that contradicts the basic principles of their current self-identification, origins, and so on, can forever close the door for the researcher, since researcher's work is followed in many different ways. Therefore, it is necessary to constantly re-examine fieldwork, to always find new ways to conduct it and to adapt it to the given circumstances, and very often to develop research strategies on the spot which will help you access and understand foreign culture better. Thank you for your attention.
Hello everyone, and thank you for watching my presentation. Today I will talk about an attempt of using a new research model which, to my knowledge, hasn't previously been applied in ethnomusicology. Since the first attempts of defining the discipline until today, the subject of studying ethnomusicology has come significantly closer from others to ourselves, which has determined two key positions of researchers, insider and outsider. The matter of the firstness and the secondness is no longer a matter of geography, but a personal choice of an individual in the world as a global village that may make everyone potentially an insider to all societies as musical homogenization grows. I found myself in the position of an insider in the period between 2009 and 2012 in the area of Golia, where I spent a significant part of my childhood visiting and staying at my relatives for longer periods of time. I thought that knowing the mentality, costumes, celebrations, sound of instruments and singing would make the work much easier and faster to do. The results from the field, however, were somewhat different. The picture they presented showed the tradition in a form slightly different from the one I thought corresponded to the real situation. I will now show you a part of the data concerning the older form of vocal expression known as a singing na glas. An important factor of the melopoetic system, also emphasized by the informants, is the lyrics, the content of which points to everyday use. To know a song means to know words, whose semantics are more important than the musical level in the communication process. The structure of the verse is octosyllabic or decasyllabic, and the melostrophy can be constructed from one verse, repeated verse, two verses, and so on. The most representative type of older vocal style characteristic for this region was realized using a maximum of 3 melodic motifs, as can be seen in the next example. The melostrophy begins with the initial A motif that includes the first 4 syllables of the lyrics. It is followed by the similar downwards oriented B motif where the already sung semi-verse is repeated. The contrast is brought by the motif C, with its goal being reaching a certain type of culmination of the musical move in the form of long holding finales. The frequency, combination and relation between the presented motifs directly affect the form, which manifests in 6 ways. The first formal category represents the most numerous group of examples, and therefore can be considered the basis in relation to which we will observe other categories. The example we just saw belongs to this one, so it will not be explained further. We will only take a look at the schematic representation so that we can keep track on the other categories. The first line represents the structure of music, and the second and third one is the structure of the poetic system. Except for ornamental variations, which as a rule appear with the repetition of the mellow verse, the second section can also include a pause before the C motif. The second formal category is shortened of the first appearance of the B motif. The third one shows the absence of the initial A and B motifs. It should be noted that this model is never used in the whole song, but rather in the first melostrophy, which can lead to the conclusion that its use doesn't represent a future of this type of singing. Only 2 examples go under the fourth one, whose scheme looks like this. In the fifth category, the whole second section is missing. Compared to the basic model, the biggest contrast in terms of the structure and the melody can be seen in the sixth one. The biggest difference is the appearance of the C motif as the final one at the end of the section. Before it appears, the syllabic motif, which in terms of all of its characteristics doesn't vary from the first 2, which we therefore could also mark as A/B. The older type of vocal dialect of Golia is realized in the interval of third over non-tempered sequences. A very strong, nasal and penetrating singing typical of the mountainous regions is high in pitch regardless of the singer's gender. If the song is being performed by few singers, interval of the second will appear, which then make the one-part singing into heterophonic. The melody is abundant in various types of ornament, some of which always take place in the melostrophy after C motif. My personal impression, based on a lot of experience and practical knowledge of tradition, didn't add up with the part of the data, which then made me think about possible ways of interpreting my subjective feeling, while at the same time following the basic principle of science objectivity. Then the idea of a repeated field research came up, but in which the roles of the researcher and the informant would be reversed, with the goal of observing informant's reaction in the role of the audience. I found the basic theoretical ground within the action research types originated at the half of the past century. The person most responsible for the development of the action research is considered to be the social psychologist Kurt Lewin, who is often said to be the first to use the formulation action research to describe a form of research which made it possible for the laws about social phenomena to be tested and tried in practice. His opinion was that experimenting plays a big role in the attempt to make a change. Therefore, he built the action research on the paradigm of experimental manipulation and observation of the effects of the changes made. Levin's ideas have been developed in different directions by different authors. I will name only a few aspects which I later used upon researching the music of Golia. Action research is a participatory democratic process directed at developing practical knowledge in search for the generally valid human goals, which are based on a participatory view of the world. Researching a social situation with the intention of upgrading the quality of action within the situation. An intervention of a lesser degree concerning functioning in real conditions and careful examination of effects of such intervention. The subject of action research aren't isolated phenomena, but concrete praxis, where changing the praxis is the primary goal of the action research, while at the same time being a way of cognizing the praxis. In relation to their meta-theoretical fundaments, Cassell and Johnson discern four approaches. Experimental action research includes research conducted by Kurt Lewin under the strong influence of the positivistic scientific paradigm, with the idea of studying social phenomena by changing them and observing the effects of that change, without sacrificing the rigor of hypothesis testing and losing connection with praxis. Within inductive action researches, which emphasize knowledge of practical reasoning of informants and their implicit applicable theories, the researcher gains insight into these informal realities through observation with participation. The goal of involving the informants is to extract and question their intuitive understandings through the process of reflection. In addition to approach the subjective meaning of the informants, a neutral language of observation is maintained in this form, which is one of the key characteristics of the positivistic scientific paradigm. The ground and theory is thus a procedure which satisfies the criteria of strict science, such as significance, comparability, repeatability, verification, while at the same time emphasizing naturalism and ecological validity. Participatory form of action research, which practically stems from the aforementioned, implies that the role of the expert researcher moves toward the role of the helper. The constructive practice is action research of postmodernists, unlike discursive closure that implies the dominance of a certain discourse, is aimed towards disturbing hegemony by creating space for alternative narratives. One can rhetorically produce as many realities as there are different ways of describing and explaining phenomena. Starting from the fact that human behavior is mostly intentional and meaningful, and that it consists of actions that have a subjective meaning for the people who perform them, the applicability of the action model in modern ethnomusicology is reflected in the representation of a qualitative method of repeated field work with participatory observation with the reflexive paradigm. Music as a product of subjective human action cannot be perceived in a neutral way, independently of the subject, of his intentions and motives, of the significance that a given behavior has for him. The implementation of this model is done with the goal of accepting the knowledge and experience of the informants, who thus become valid collaborators in the production of conclusions. The specificity of action research is reflected in researchers causing changes in existing results and observing the reactions of informants in additional in-depth structured interviews. I changed the parameters listed in the previous part of my presentation in a controlled manner and played the artificially created experimental examples not only to the informants, but also to the wider community whose role within the field research is marginalized. Each experimental example had one control example between which the listener had to choose the one that according to them defined the vocal expression of their region more closely. Here is a brief overview of these changes, some of which were created by software processing and others resung and recorded. The lyrics of the song was replaced by the lyrics of a song of the other distant region, which belongs to the ritual practice, while the melody was retained with all its properties. while the control example was done the other way around. The text recorded in the field was sung to the melody of a ritual song. The tonal sequence was refined from being untempered and narrow to a variant close to the diatonic sequence, and the original version was played as the control example. The following pair of examples examined the relation of the observer to the ornamentation that was omitted in the experiment, especially in places typical of it. High intonation, nasal tone, powerful and loud singing were given a counterpart in the experimental example with opposite parameters. A short interval of second was inserted randomly into the one-part performance in order to examine whether the tradition should be heterophonic or unisono. A pause that appeared sporadically during the singing was inserted into the example that did not contain it, and the original was played as the control example, where all other parameters were equal. In order to examine which form is the most acceptable one, I constructed 6 variants of one performance by omitting or adding sections, so that all other parameters would be the same and so that listeners would make a choice primarily based on the form. After applying repeated field research with the wider community and playing of the examples and recording their verbal and non-verbal reactions, I came to the following results. All observers picked out the example in which the melody remained the same, regardless of the lyrics which had been taken from another tradition. One of them was aware of the procedure and added that despite the fact that the lyrics does not belong to that region, he would choose that example because it is melody with which he identifies. The textual component, therefore, is not as important as it had been emphasized during the first research. A tone sequence is a category that was unanimously chosen to match the original. The ethnicity, despite my personal preconception, probably based on a long period of education, did not meet approval from the community. In a large number of cases, ornaments were not recognized as a deciding factor. Judging by the non-verbal reactions, it could be said that in most cases the informants weren't really sure what the differences were and that they chose an example approximately. High intonation of vocal expression was recognized together with the timbre as relevant, unlike dynamics which played almost no role at all. After having applied the action research model, we can claim that this is a one-part tradition in which the dissonances are the result of errors and the inability to sing in unison. One of the basic aesthetic principles comes from this position, which implies the singers must match both the timbre and intonation so that one doesn't get the impression that two singers are singing. The appearance of a pause, it turns out, is not the result of a shortness of breath, but it has a musical significance. According to Dimitrija Golemović, we can characterize it as a kind of refrain pause. Out of a total of 6 formal types, only the first and third were singled out as irrelevant upon the re-examination. I would like to point out that the number of these examples is smaller compared to other categories, and that the third one is present just in first melostrophy. The results obtained by conducting this way of research contribute to a more comprehensive understanding of emic knowledge through interpretive narratives of individual experiences, which further resonates with the ethic interpretation of the processuality of a given musical tradition. Since this approach was based on experimental manipulation and observation of the effects of given changes, it can be applied equally to other types of singing as well as to instrumental music. If we follow correct methodological procedures, we can collect data on independent social reality in an objective and neutral way and empirically test predictions about causal relationships that are deduced from a priori set theories. At first glance, it seems that the role of the researcher shifted from a distant expert to a reflective participant in the everyday life of a social organization. However, it's about a qualitative positivism because the reflection was based on objectively derived and evaluated conclusion of researcher based on direct observation during his participation. In my case, the action research based on experimenting largely confirmed my suspicions caused by the mismatch of the insider's position with the original results of the analysis. This procedure has not yet been sufficiently applied in ethnomusicology to talk about its scientific contribution. However, I hope that it will serve as an inspiration for further application and development. Thank you.